Projection rarely feels like projection. It feels like observation. You look at someone and immediately notice something about them. They seem arrogant. They seem insecure. They seem dishonest. The perception appears clear, almost obvious. You feel confident in the judgment. Their behavior confirms it. Their tone supports it. Their reactions reinforce it. From your perspective, you are simply noticing what is there. But perception rarely begins with the other person. It often begins inside you, with traits that feel uncomfortable to acknowledge: fear of rejection, sensitivity to criticism, hidden insecurity. These experiences exist internally, but internal experiences are difficult to confront directly. They challenge identity. They create vulnerability. The mind often protects itself from that discomfort by moving the trait outward. Instead of recognizing the feeling inside, the mind begins noticing it outside, in someone else. The person becomes labeled quickly. They are insecure. They are manipulative. They are judgmental. The label feels accurate because the emotion attached to it is real. The discomfort you feel is genuine. The reaction in your body is genuine. But the location of the trait has shifted. The mind has taken something internal and placed it in the other person, without noticing the movement. This process is called projection, but the mind never experiences it that way. It experiences clarity. The judgment feels sharp. The conclusion feels reasonable, because the emotional signal is strong. But the emotional signal did not originate in the observation. It originated earlier, from experiences that shaped how you interpret behavior, from insecurities that feel difficult to face, from traits that conflict with the identity you prefer to maintain. Projection allows those traits to remain hidden, because if the trait exists in someone else, it does not have to exist in you. The mind preserves the identity it wants to believe, and the other person becomes the container for what remains unrecognized inside, which is why projection rarely feels like distortion. It feels like accurate observation, even when what you are seeing began inside you. Projection does not feel like imagination. It feels like evidence. When the mind forms a judgment about someone, it begins looking for confirmation. A glance, a hesitation, a particular tone of voice. Each small signal becomes part of the interpretation, and the interpretation begins strengthening itself. If you believe someone is arrogant, confidence begins looking like arrogance. If you believe someone is manipulative, ordinary persuasion begins looking like control. If you believe someone is insecure, moments of uncertainty begin confirming the belief. The mind gathers details that support the conclusion. Signals that contradict the conclusion become less visible, less convincing, easier to dismiss. This process feels logical because the mind experiences a consistent pattern. The behavior seems to match the judgment again and again. But the pattern was shaped before the observation began. The expectation created the filter, and the filter organizes what you notice. Projection becomes convincing because it interacts with confirmation. Each perceived signal strengthens the belief. The belief then shapes the next interpretation. The cycle reinforces itself. Soon the judgment feels obvious, almost undeniable, because the mind has constructed a complete narrative about the other person. Inside that narrative, the person appears consistent, predictable, understandable. But the clarity belongs to the interpretation. not necessarily the person. Projection becomes powerful because it feels observational. You are noticing real behaviors, real expressions, real reactions. But the meaning attached to those signals was formed earlier, inside your own emotional structure, which is why projection often feels so convincing. The evidence appears visible, but the lens interpreting that evidence is invisible. And when the lens remains unseen, the interpretation feels like simple observation, a clear reading of someone else, even when the clarity originated inside you. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Projection becomes strongest when something inside you remains unresolved. Traits that feel uncomfortable rarely disappear. They become difficult to acknowledge, difficult to integrate, difficult to include in the identity you prefer to maintain. The mind then looks for distance. Distance from the trait. If insecurity feels threatening, the mind searches for insecurity in others. If dishonesty feels intolerable, you begin noticing dishonesty everywhere. If anger feels unacceptable, you begin seeing aggression in the people around you. The trait becomes easier to confront outside yourself, because when it belongs to someone else, your identity remains intact. The internal conflict becomes external observation. The discomfort finds a new location. Projection often reveals what the mind struggles to face directly, not because the person you are observing has no flaws, but because the intensity of your reaction often reflects something internal. The stronger the emotional charge, the more likely the trait touches something familiar, something unfinished. This is why certain behaviors trigger unusually strong reactions. Someone shows confidence, and it feels arrogant. Someone expresses doubt, and it feels weak. Someone asserts boundaries, and it feels selfish. The interpretation reflects more than the behavior. It reflects the relationship you have with that trait inside yourself. If confidence feels threatening internally, confidence in others may look excessive. If vulnerability feels unsafe, vulnerability in others may look manipulative. Projection protects identity. It keeps certain traits outside awareness, outside ownership, outside responsibility. The other person becomes the mirror, but the reflection feels like accusation. You see the trait clearly in them, you feel justified reacting to it, and the internal conflict remains hidden. Projection is not simply misunderstanding. It is displacement, a movement of awareness away from the self toward the other person, which is why projection rarely feels like self-protection. It feels like accurate judgment, even when the judgment began with something inside you that had not yet been recognized. Projection begins losing its power the moment it becomes visible. Not visible in the other person, visible in yourself. At first, the interpretation still feels convincing. You notice a trait. You feel a reaction. The conclusion appears obvious. But awareness introduces a small interruption. A quiet question. Why does this reaction feel so strong? The behavior may still be real. The person may still have flaws. But the intensity of your reaction becomes something to examine. Not just the behavior you are observing, but the emotional signal inside you. What does this trait represent to you? Why does it provoke such certainty? Why does it feel so uncomfortable to witness? These questions shift attention inward, toward the internal landscape. Sometimes the answer is simple. The person is genuinely difficult. But sometimes the reaction reveals something else. A trait you have struggled with. A fear you prefer not to confront. An insecurity that feels safer to locate outside yourself. Projection begins dissolving when ownership appears. When the mind recognizes, this reaction belongs to me, not entirely to them. That recognition does not eliminate perception. You still observe behavior. You still interpret situations. But the certainty softens. The other person becomes less of a container for your internal conflict. They begin separating from the traits you once assigned to them. You notice something that was previously invisible. The difference between observation and projection. Observation describes behavior. Projection describes interpretation. And interpretation often carries pieces of the self. Once you see that process, your perception becomes quieter, less certain, less reactive, more curious. The other person begins appearing more clearly, not as a reflection of your internal fears, but as someone separate from them. If this perspective resonated, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not to eliminate projection completely, but to notice when what you see in others quietly begins inside you.